Thank you, Matthew.
So what I wanted to talk about briefly today is living standards, because I think that really is going to be the critical test of this budget, is what it does for living standards. Living standards, both what it does for living standards now, what it's going to do for living standards over time for families across the economy in a number of ways. And I think that really breaks down into three components. First, how will this affect people's pay? Secondly, how will it affect their take-home pay? And finally, how far will that pay go once they've taken it home? It's their wages after direct taxes, and then how will it affect prices? So firstly on pay, and here I think is where there's the best news out of the budget. There are two ways in which taxes can really affect pay. Firstly is there are taxes on business where the incidence, where the burden mostly falls on labour. Corporation tax, the US Congressional Budget Office thinks 70% of that burden is borne by domestic labour. There are a number of academic studies which have come to similar results that most of that burden falls on labour. So actually the corporation tax cuts announced will mean higher or are very likely to mean higher wages over time. And I think that there is therefore a direct impact on the public, as well as an impact on business and business confidence coming out of the corporation tax cuts because of that incidence. The second thing is increasing productivity growth, a fundamental driver of wages. And here again we've got good news. If you look at academic research, OECD research, two taxes that were cut yesterday tend to reduce the increase in total factor productivity. Which sounds like a very academic variable, but it's the absolute underlies future economic prosperity and particularly wages. Now, lower corporate tax starts to lead to higher total factor productivity, and so is lower top marginal income tax rates, because both of those improve the incentive to invest, innovate, and therefore drive those opportunities from jobs and wages over time. So I think that we have those two measures which are likely to mean higher wages, and that means the fundamentally, the starting point, as far as living standards go, is quite good. I don't think the revenue cost is going to be substantial. Most studies have found that the peak of the Laffer curve for corporate taxes is low and falling, and I think the top marginal rate, the report that the HRC has produced, has huge uncertainty in it, and obviously that uncertainty can cut both ways. But particularly over the medium term, I think it's well acknowledged in that report that most of the uncertainty in terms of revenue from higher rates is on the downside, because as people start to think this isn't a temporary tax rise, as they start to develop new strategies to adjust to that tax rise, that will lead to a greater behavioural response over time. So I think probably, if anything, the Treasury is still some way from reflecting the real revenue maximising rate on this tax. So that's where there's a lot of good news, is on what the effect this might actually have on people's wages. Where I think there's more of a challenge is on take-home pay. Now again, we start with some good news, and we produced a briefing on the budget yesterday, which there are quite a few on the chairs. If you don't have any, there are more steadily coming. And a critical graph in there is on page 5. So anyone who has got a copy or can take a look at someone else's, take a look at page 5. Because what that's showing is the marginal tax rates at different stages of income across the income distribution. It's showing how the personal allowance has increased, but what we've done there, and this is what isn't normally done in most of these graphs, is we've adjusted the thresholds for growth in earnings. And so what this also captures is fiscal drag, that process where people get dragged into ever higher bands because of growth in earnings, and those thresholds not keeping up. Now, what you can see a number of things that have happened there over time. That bottom blue line is 2001-02. You can see that the personal allowance has got more generous above inflation. However, rates are up across the distribution, principally because of the rise in national insurance contributions. And there are a number of quite significant rises for high earners earning above £100,000, and a lot more people are paying the higher rates. It starts a lot earlier once adjusted for average earnings. So I think in a number of ways we're seeing here a tax system which has certainly increased marginal rates, but there is an improvement at the very high income level with the cuts in what was the 50p rate is now the 45p rate. But still, this is if you look at these combined marginal rates, which is what it should be, the combined tax on labour income, including national insurance, we start after the personal allowance at a 40% rate. We then go at the higher rates to 50%. We then go to almost 60, being cut to over 50. So the reality of the rates people are facing, and then obviously there's a very high rate at the withdrawal of the personal allowance. The reality of the rates people are facing on their labour income, and this isn't including benefit withdrawal, which makes the situation in some cases even worse, particularly now with the withdrawal of child benefit. Very high rates, disincentivising, driving a wedge between the amount people are paid by the employers and the amount they receive. And I think that is going to have a serious effect on growth and disincentive effects. So that's what we're going. But, so there's some good news there in the personal allowance for living standards, but there's some bad news in the age-related allowances. The freeze is one thing, and I think the freeze, the impact per person will be relatively low. I think the critical group who are going to get hit very hard are those turning 65 after at the beginning of the next financial year. Those people are going to see £259 less in personal allowance than they might have expected, even leaving aside things like inflation. Because they're going to get £1,295 less of personal allowance, they'll be £259 worse off. So finally, moving on to prices. Fuel duty keeps getting hammered. We're going to continue to have these high taxes, normally the highest in Europe, normally the second highest in the world, after Turkey. So tobacco is going to get hit very hard. For most smokers, and that's maybe why Mark's home ill, for most smokers, it's going to entirely wipe out the increase in the personal allowance, just the increase in tobacco taxes. And we know it's a very regressive hat tax, hits the poor hardest. We've got a table about that in that document, setting out how it wipes out the personal allowance increase. Stamp duty. It's an ugly structure of a tax. This slab rate means that people with, someone with 2 properties is going to get very hard with someone with 1 high-value property won't. Someone with, a mansion in the countryside might not get hit, where someone with a relatively modest house in the city will. There are lots of inequities in this, but it's not going to be affecting many people. In November 2011, there were only 121 sales that would qualify based on the land registry data. More might be brought in given the changes to avoidance, but still, raising like £300 million is not particularly significant, but it does exacerbate the ugliness of that tax, which, let's remember, the IFS Merlis review argued should be abolished entirely. And of course, there are also other VAT changes. So overall, I think this is a positive budget for most families in terms of their living standards, but certain groups will be particularly hard hit. Imagine someone who's going to turn 65 next August, lives in a small town, and is a smoker. There are a lot of those people around. They are not particularly fortunate people on the large. They will be hit thanks to the combination of rising fuel duty, rising tobacco taxes, and the removal of the age-related allowance extremely hard. And I think you could have got a fairer result and achieved the same policy objective of aligning the allowances just with the freeze. So I think that there are some people being hit particularly hard. However, particularly thanks to the growth in total factor productivity, I think for most families, this is a positive budget for their living standards. And the real question they'll be asking is, could this go further? Could there have been a greater vision for a lower tax for lower taxes in the medium term, or more stronger action in this budget? But the overall picture for them will be positive.